So we had just finished talking about our life tables, and we had just done sort of a multi-year example. So this is one of the main ways that we can calculate and predict future year growth when we have a lot of information about a population, particularly survival rates, fecundity, and all of this. So this is a nice way to like bury your fingers in and get a good in-depth look at a population. The next thing that we're going to do is look at two other ways from a more an equation or a graphical standpoint. We're going to look at the equations, but I'm not going to make you do any crazy math things like derive the equations, right? So we're going to look at the core of the equations, what are called lambda and r, and what they mean. So we're going to explain the difference between them because that's important because it has to do with breeding. But again, we're not going to dig in and do any crazy calculus with it. So don't get intimidated. Okay, so as we look at these, our core concept here is to, in both cases, even when we're looking at life tables, sort of implicitly was understanding growth rates. Okay? How is a population changing or growing from year to year, right? And this can be both positive or negative, as we saw with our life tables. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at lambda, which is the symbol you see here. And this is generally the more common one. So this is the population growth rate. And so really what we're talking about here is exactly pretty much what we were doing with the life tables, but it's kind of more of a snapshot. Okay? So we just have what was the population next year or this year compared to a previous year. Okay? This is what we mean by future year to a more current year. Okay. This would literally just be equals future year over previous year. So that's really all we're talking about, is what is the rate of change. So let's look at our graph here and get an idea of how this kind of looks. And there's a lot of different ways that we're going to look at this and the way this information can be valuable. All right, so our graph here, we see our x-axis is time. Okay, so we're going to look at consecutive years for a given population that we've been tracking them. Okay. Our y-axis, excuse me, our y-axis is that population growth rate, right? It's really tiny, so I'm going to make that bigger. That's our lambda. Okay. So we're looking at what is the rate of change for that population from one year to the next. There's a couple of things that we can get out of this by just glancing at it. So if I take a population size, let's say 100, that's what we've been working with the life tables, and times it by 1, what's my population size next year? Don't overthink it. 100 still, right? Okay. So 1 is our baseline of no growth. Which means then anything bigger than 1 So 100 times 1.2 means that my population is growing, right? We can do that math. I really wanted to. How gross and skivy this is. 100 times 1.2. Oh, God, that's dumb. Why am I tired? This is the decimal, right? It's 120, right? So it's a positive population growth rate. So anything this way is growth, right? Positive. So anything bigger than 1, positive population growth. Okay, by the very nature then, anything less than 1, so if I did 100 times 0.8, I get 80, right? Okay, so I shrunk. How are you supposed to shrink at all? Let's try that again. This is negative growth. This is one of the reasons things like lambda are really valuable, because it's kind of an easy snapshot to see what is the health of your population. Okay. Change colors. So as I graph population growth rate over the last 10-ish years, okay, I can see that the vast majority of it is above 1. Okay. So most of the time, our population is very healthy. Okay. Most of the time, we're growing. So without knowing anything else, and we have that glean of information. See so far? There's another thing that we notice right away. I'll clean this up a little. There's a lot on here. Okay. So if we look at the beginning years of this population, there's really wide oscillation. In other words, now, right, we're getting big swings. After several years, we see what's called the dampening. I'm talking about here, or stabilization. So our population rates can go from really big jumps, okay, we breed a lot, there's a lot of us, we're having lots of babies, to a lot of us died off. Okay? And there's a lot of us again, and a lot of us died off. And when we get into things like competition and predator-prey interactions, we'll look at what causes some of these things. Okay, but we can imagine a few reasons. Okay, so for example, if we look at having a really high population, okay, maybe there was a good year, there was a lot of us born, everything was good. If we had a really, really good year and there was a really lot of us, and we ate all of our food resources that year, what happens to all of the babies that were born that year? They're going to have an easy time growing up? No, they're going to have a hard time, right? Because all their parents, all the many parents, okay, ate all the food. Okay? So everybody that grew up are going to have lower birth and a lower survival rate, right? Coping with the reduced amount of food resources. Okay. So you see that back and forth a little bit until they chill out. They usually chill out due to the fact that the environment exists, right? The forest is only so big, predators are going to eat them, right? So you can't end up with 6,452 rabbits. So we're not going to end up with numbers up here, right? Owls will eat them, wolves will eat them. There's not enough tail to support them. Okay? And it won't stay way down here because there is always more tail. Okay? And if there is not enough rabbits, then wolves will die off, right? And their population will reduce and give them a chance to rebound. So you'll see this slow stabilization around whatever number makes sense for the area. And we'll talk about carrying capacity a little bit at the end here. So that's what we mean, stabilization due to environmental effects. And these can be abiotic, okay, rain tolerances or whatever, or they can be biotic, predator pressures, food resources, whatever the case may be. Our big key is what the population growth rate is giving us in a second is what the life tables couldn't, is I immediately can see, are we growing or are we shrinking? Very quickly. Our life table still gave us that, right? It just took us a little longer to find the information we needed. Now, I don't have things like fecundity and survival rates and any of that information here, right? So this is more of a survey of material, not in-depth material. So it depends on what you want. Any questions so far on what we're getting here? Now, when we have these age-specific fecundities and survivals, this is the kind of stuff we used in our life tables. We find that most populations are going to grow at fixed rates. And this is what we saw in our last one. After it took a hot second, right, that lambda settled out at 1.3, right? We ended up with a fixed growth rate. This is common. Okay, so our population generally grows at a fixed rate. Okay. People, organisms, all survive and have about the same survival rate. When you're 5, you survive about this well. When you're 50, you survive about this well. Okay. When you're 5, you're this likely to have babies. When you're 50, you're this likely to have babies. Okay. So in lieu of any crazy changes, just like we saw with the life tables, we can use that information to predict a rate. So instead of having to calculate every year using this information, what's the population size going to be for next year, we can use this information to create a rate. Because you wouldn't expect the rate of change to be significantly different. If everybody's just as likely to survive the same every year, and you're just as likely to have the same amount of kids every year. You should see the same amount of growth and loss every year. This also means that your age structure isn't going to change, right? So as we think about packet of breeding individuals, right? Those individuals are all going to have 2 kids apiece, okay, and our 30% chance of survival, or whatever it is. Okay. You're always going to have the exact same replacement underneath you, okay, and the exact same chance of shifting up to the next group. Okay. Same for the group underneath you. So sort of like if we think back to our life table example, how that number sat at 100, So our grand total is, give or take, about 100 the whole time. Okay. The top number, our age 0, was always around 80. Right? Our age 1s were always around 30 or 6. Right? And then our age 2s were always around 30. Okay. Those numbers that we had changed a little, but we're always about the same number, no matter how many years we did this. So that's what we mean by the age distribution isn't going to change. The actual numbers will likely change. It went from 8 to 6. Okay? Went from 30 to 24. The numbers themselves changed, okay, but they're pretty much the same value. Okay? They're going to stay around the same number. Because the fecundity hasn't changed, your chance of survival hasn't changed. And we don't have a sudden mass of new individuals. No volcanoes have exploded. So nothing really dramatic has happened. That makes sense? Okay, so pretty much all we've done here is said, look, all this information from the life tables, we can use that. It's unchanging. Your population is unchanging. Okay, so why don't we just use that to make a rate? Make sense what we're doing here? Except now we don't have to do those life tables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 100 times to try to figure out what's going to go on 100 years from now. Sounds a lot better. But we don't like life tables. Now here's the problem. If fecundity or survival rates change, your growth rate is certainly going to change, right? So if we think about your fecundity rates changing from a 2 to a 5, that's a big deal, right? A single individual goes from being able to replace themselves to having 2 kids to having 5 kids. That's a big jump. Okay. My lambda, my growth rate, is going to change, increase to a 2. That's a big lambda, right? We were just looking at 1.3 as a growth rate for a population. So 2.0 is a huge growth rate. So basically a doubling of a population every year, which is absolutely terrifying. But then again, so is having 5 kids per person. So anytime any of the values from our life table changes, we also have to update our growth rate. And certainly, right, our age distribution would also change, right? If our fecundity changed, we would suddenly have a crap tonnery, more babies. So we would imagine these boxes would be much higher. So you'd have a very bottom-heavy, or a much more triangular-shaped pyramid, like some of the ones we saw the other day. Okay, so that's intuitive. There are not a whole lot of populations that suddenly go from having fecundity rates from 2 to 5, but intuitively you get the idea of what would happen. Okay. More often is you have populations that have sudden changes in survival rates. Okay. If something happens and the survival rate goes down, or if you're very lucky, it goes up. Okay, so let's look at what the effect on the actual population size is. So Here's our lambda. Remember, we're not actually going to calculate these, so don't freak out that I'm showing you an equation, right? Here's our growth rate. This is where this is valuable. So we have our growth rate. Okay, so this would be population of this year. So where it becomes valuable, or whatever year that we know. We can take a population of this year times our growth rate and know up of next year. This is basically just the inverse of the equation we talked about on the definition page, right? All we did was move it around. Not so terrifying. Here's what's really key when we're looking at this growth rate. Okay, so we can see that we're always moving this around by a constant value. That constant value being whatever lambda is moving us by. And we're moving it by a time period. And this is going to be really important when we compare this to R, which is the other type. Because these graphs are going to look super frustrating. Okay. So if we look at our graph, we have time at the bottom. But instead of the y-axis, instead of having lambda now, right, we have population size. Okay, so by time intervals, we can see what exactly is our population abundance, and we can do this as total abundance, or we could, if we wanted to, convert it to density, right, per something like per hectare, meter squared, or whatever. So this gives us an idea of what is the total population size, and how has it grown over time. And it always has sort of loopy look to it, J shape, until we get to carrying capacity. We'll find it's going to have that infinite growth until we hit whatever environmental cap it has. So we'll add that cap in a bit. Certainly we can't go up to 1 million, right? But for now, we're just going to ignore that. Okay, so the key here is we're doing this each time period. Right, so what this time period means matters per organism, right? So it might be per year if they're breeding on a yearly period. Okay, might be per quarter, okay, if they're breeding multiple times a year. Okay, so whatever that breeding period is, oops, I'm erasing here. Okay, depends. I've made this simple and I've just done it per year, like mammals. Okay, so maybe it's like an antelope and they have the yearly breeding cycles. Nice and easy, much easier to picture in our heads. So whatever that year is, we are adding the new guild of babies. And we're always adding the new babies by that constant proportion, whatever that growth rate is. Okay. Remember that growth rate is calculated by the fecundity and survival rate, those values that we got. Okay, so really all we've done is sort of twisted that previous graph sideways, right, like on its head. Instead of looking at the growth rate, we're looking at the population size. It's still the same information. Make sense? Still with me? So here's the problem. There's another type of growth rate called exponential growth. Now, I promise you this is a different graph. It looks exactly the same. The big difference here is with this one, we still have constant proportion of change, but this is at instants in time. Okay. So this is going to be significantly less common. And the big key difference here is with our previous one, we expected discrete time steps. Those are going to be organisms that breed yearly. Everybody gets together once a year. Okay, our antelopes all get together. Let's breed, all our babies come out at once, right? Okay. Or we're going to have fishes that are going to have the big spawning run. Okay, all the babies are at it. And this is much more common. This situation, our exponential growth, they have very specific generational overlap. This is much more unusual, but these are going to be organisms with which they pretty much breed year-round. So humans, we don't all get together and decide, everybody have babies in August, right? Those sorts of, some insects like bees, right? They're just birthed anytime they're not sleeping. Okay, from the moment that they wake up, okay, to the moment that they hibernate. Baby, 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 baby. Okay, there's no generation. Okay, so any organism that doesn't have discrete breeding periods has this. Okay. We still have a growth rate. And so as we add, we can still predict over the course of a year how many individuals are going to be changed. Okay. And we can break that up into smaller units. Okay. And say our growth for each instant in time should be this much. But we understand that this is not going to happen over years. So the way that we calculate that growth rate is per instant in time, not yearly or monthly or whatever it is. Okay, so this is our big difference here. Time interval, okay, versus continuous. Okay, so fundamentally, these are super similar, right? This has a lot more to do with applicability and a crap ton of background math we don't care about. Okay, so what I really care about is we know when would we use these different things. That's what I care about. Okay, so lambda is for our discrete time. I breed once a year. This exponential growth is R. Fundamentally, functions the same way. Okay, like I said, a little bit more calculus involved in how they figured it out, how it's applied, right? Because we're worried about our final result being the rate of change for a population at a single instant in time. That's where we're figuring it out. Okay, but we're still starting with the current population, how many humans are in the world right now. Okay. We're going to use the rate of change, R, instead of lambda. So humans, bees, bunnies, meerkats, a lot of those animals fall under this one. Okay? It's a much smaller group. You can name like single individual or organisms that do this. Whereas most organisms have discrete breeding seasons. Right? Frogs breed in the spring. And polar bears. Whatever it is, right? Most of those organisms have discrete breeding time periods. All birds. Those guys are all going to be using the lambda. The difference between these two and when we use them, very clear. Any questions about the difference between R and lambda? And like I said, I'm not going to make you calculate the actual rates. We are going to use them. Okay, so I really do want to make sure that we feel good about this. So remember that geometric and exponential growth curves, the graphs looked exactly the same. And that makes sense, right? Because at that point, all we're looking at is what does the population abundance look like from one year or one time step to the next. So if you were working in a field office and said, well, what do the human population look like in 2010 versus 2020? Right? You're probably not going to say, well, what did it look like the 15th of October versus the 16th of October versus 7th, like that. We got time. Okay? So that's not the way we look at data, and that would be the way you would have to look at it to really see the difference between R and lambda. Okay, so that's why the graphs for R and lambda look the same, because you're just looking at the overall population abundance over time. And that way, you're actually looking at the time steps exactly the same. We're just looking at growth. Okay. Also, because if we look at the equations, they look pretty much the same. Right? Here's our growth rate. Here's the population now. All we're getting in the end is the population at some point later. Ultimately, via some math, you can get back and forth between lambda and R. Right? Because really, critically, the difference between the two is time steps, right? R is tiny time steps, right? And lambda are discrete. That stinks. Lambda is discrete time steps. And so we can use calculus to get between them. Again, something I'm not going to ask you to do. I want you to understand it's possible. And that's why they look so similar. So it's something we do need to be very cognizant of. Right, so grand scheme, from a calculus standpoint, okay, they're fundamentally very similar things. So we really want to focus on how is the organism that we're interested in performing its reproduction. So focused on the is and are business, I can't use any other words now. Okay, so we're focused on, are they doing it discretely, okay, or in very specific time steps? So they have a breeding season, or are they just doing it just continuously whenever they can, okay, without generations, without any adherence to each other as a population or a species? Let's look at them together here. So remember we said when we were looking at lambda, let's just focus on this middle block for a second. Okay. Lambda of 1 was our baseline, right? We discovered that from our definition. Our lambda of 1 was our baseline. That meant no population growth. Right? 100 times 1 is still 100. When we're doing R, we kind of have to meld our brain a little. Okay. R is centered around 0 instead. So maybe it's almost more intuitive. Okay, so literally an R of 0 is 0 population growth. So that's why we're getting a flat line for both of these. So let's look to the right here then. So we remember then my lambda of greater than 1, right? We did like 1.2. 1.2 times 100 was 120. It's giving me positive population growth. In this case, R of greater than 0. Okay, these are usually decimals. Okay, so like an R of 0.3. Is going to be population growth. But in this case, really, an R of a positive number. Again, we have a little bit of intuitiveness there, right? So positive R gives us positive growth rate. Okay, so we see this very familiar J-shaped business. So now let's go all the way to the left. Again, right, a lambda less than 1, so we did like 0.8 in our example. 0.8 times 100 gave us 80. That was negative growth rate. So we can see this nice decline. And again, R is being a little more intuitive here. We have R less than 0. Okay, so in this case, literally, R being a negative number will be negative growth rate. Okay. Any questions about the definitions or how we want to look at lambda versus R? Feel okay? Let's practice with one then. So if I have a human population size, and this was the human population growth rate in 2017. Okay, so I have R of 0.01. Okay. The current human population is 7.7 billion. It's not anymore, but it was at the time. Let's start with, we'll probably end with this. Let's project human population for next year.
So how do I tackle this? It always stinks when you get really big numbers, right? What did you guys do? If you get this on a test? That's with zero effort and sig figs, of course, so. Dr. Haas is probably hating me from his vacation home and wherever he is right now. Okay. So I've lazied this out. But really all we've done is I took just the leader number here, right, our 7.7, and times it by our rate of change. Because the rest of it is just a bajillion zeros, right? And that gives me this really sad looking decimal, which is not actually sad, right? It's a huge number. So there's a bajillion zeros involved here. I've decided to not deal with the zeros because zeros suck and zeros are hard. So if I wanted to do my sig figs and round, what I actually would end up with is just shy of 7.8 billion, right? I can leave it like this. And what I know is what we've added basically is like 84 million people to the skip. And I was pretty lazy, and all I know is I had 7.7 here. I just added the 0.083 to the 7.7. I just didn't deal with the billion at all because I didn't want to. It's easy not to. And this is just as easy to look at 7.784 as moving all that other business around is. Everybody see that? So this this is just as easy to deal with. What we really care with is the answer right now. Okay, so we're going to start here on Friday, and we're going to look at, if I had to tackle this, how could I do this without spending 45 minutes on it? Right. I wouldn't want to do this 25 times. All right. I will see you all on Friday. Please have a good day. Let's stop.